Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very special event for the UK launch of Russell Banks's new novel, Foregone, published by No Exit Press. I'm delighted to be your host and moderator for this evening. My name is Roland Gulliver. I'm the director of the Toronto International Festival of Authors, but I'm here in the UK because of this pandemic world which we live in. So I'm UK present, but in a kind of Canadian state of mind. Traveling between two places, which maybe, is kind of apt to how we're going to go in this conversation this evening about Russell's new book. I'm delighted and honoured to welcome Russell, who's kind of one of those iconic writers that I've known for many, many years, and I'm very privileged to finally meet him. He is the author of 10 novels. The first was published back in 1975, 6 short story collections, 4 poetry collections, and a range of non-fiction titles. Foregone is his first new fiction for 10 years. Continental Drift and Cloud Splitter were shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. The Sweet Hereafter and Affliction were adapted for film and won many awards. He himself has won numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the O. Henry and Best American Short Story Award, the Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and he was also president of the International Parliament of Writers. Foregone, which I said, has been published today. Here we are. Hopefully you have your copy already. If not, you can get it at a special price from the website, but also you'll get a signed bookplate, courtesy of Russell. All I can do now is welcome Russell to the digital stage. Welcome, Russell. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Roland. It's good to see you.
Are you well? Where are you in this digital space that we live in?
Right now, I'm in Saratoga Springs, New York, and that's my backyard in the background.
It's very, very beautiful. We're very envious of the trees. So, Foregone is your new book, which is obviously it came out in Canada and the US earlier in the year. It's out in the UK today. Could you give us a little introduction to the novel, the introduction to the world of Leopold Fife? And maybe give us a little short reading.
Sure. It's a difficult book to describe in some ways because, like any novel, particularly perhaps a literary novel of ambition, it has many sources. And one of the most important sources for me, I think, is a simple fact of my age. It's not a book I would have written or could have written when I was younger. I'm now 81, and so it was a book I wrote in my late 70s into 80. And looking back kind of book. The main character, Leo Fife, is in that position, late 70s, and looking back over his life and trying to square his present with his past in some way, but doing it in a very particular way, particular to him, as a documentary filmmaker and a Canadian American who, one of the 60,000 American young men who fled to Canada in the late 60s, early 70s to avoid military service in Vietnam, where in Canada he has become a widely known and much admired leftist, muckraking kind of documentary filmmaker. And he's chosen at this point in his life, because he is in fact dying of cancer, to use his last bits of energy and the last moments in his life to give the final interview to a camera, to reverse his position as the filmmaker and be the subject of the film himself. And he's chosen his ex-student and acolyte, mentee to film this event, and as it begins with the opening of the interview with Leonard Fife, and the chapters alternate between Leonard Fife's memories and confession, and the response with the response of the people in the room filming, the director Malcolm, his cinematographer, his producer, the sound person, and 2 other most important women. Fife's widow, not yet widow, but his wife of many years, and also his producer and partner in filmmaking, Emma, and Renee Jacques, a Haitian nurse who is taking care of him and operates in the novel as a kind of reality base in some ways. I think a kind of almost a Greek chorus for it, and she's a very important presence in the novel. You mentioned you wanted me to read it, and I think I'll just read for a few minutes very quickly. The end of the first chapter, which leads us into Fife's memories and so on. There's a mention of Malcolm. That's the filmmaker, ex-student who's directing this production. Malcolm says Fife's name and the date, April 1, 2018, and location, Montreal, Quebec, and claps his hand once in front of Vincent's FS7. The camera is attached to a tripod on a track that orbits the circle of light on the bare floor and stares at the featureless, flat black side of Fife's face like the dark side of the moon. The unseen side is lit by the overhead spot. His silhouette has a molten golden edge, a penumbra surrounded by impenetrable black space. Malcolm is right. Fife still has a beautiful, brooding, bald head, at least in profile. The illness and chemo have dissolved a quarter of his body, liquefying his flesh, pushing forward the long arc of his nose and his cheekbones and prominent chin and the plates of his skull. He looks like a polished Roman coin. For a few seconds, everyone is silent, waiting for Malcolm's first question. But suddenly Fife says he's going to answer a question that no one knows to ask today. The question, he says, is simply this: why did you decide in the spring of 1968 to leave the United States and migrate to Canada? For nearly 50 years, he's been answering that question, creating and reaffirming the widespread belief, at least among Canadians, that Leonard Fife was one of the more than 60,000 young American men who fled to Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s in order to avoid being sent by the U.S. military to Vietnam. Those 60,000 men were either draft dodgers or deserters. For half a century, Leonard Fife was believed to be a draft dodger. It's what he claimed on the day he crossed the border from Vermont into Canada and asked for asylum. He's claimed it ever since that day. The truth, however, as always, is more complicated and ambiguous. Therefore, consider the preceding as merely a preface. For here begins Malcolm McLeod's controversial film, O Canada. Though brilliantly shot and edited by McLeod and produced by his wife Diana in the late Leonard Fife's own manner, it is in some ways a disheartening, disillusioning film about Fife, one of Canada's most celebrated and admired documentary filmmakers. O Canada shocked and disappointed the millions of Canadians who admired Leonard Fife for being one of those 60,000 Americans who fled north in the late 1960s to escape being sent by the American government to kill or die in Vietnam. While his film Deathbed Confession may have been cathartic for Fife himself, it has brought many Canadians to question their past and present national policy of offering asylum to so-called refugees. Refugees are people who have fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution if they return home. They are assumed to have seen or experienced many horrors. A refugee is different from an immigrant. An immigrant is a person who chooses to settle permanently in another country. Refugees are thought to have been forced to flee. Leonard Fife claimed to be a refugee. That's how the first chapter ends, and that leads us into the memories and the recounting of Fife.
And that's I think that element of talking about he's not an immigrant, he's a refugee. And the book begins from that point for Leo himself to start essentially dismantling his own story to dismantle his own history. Why was that the direction you wanted to take Leopold Fife into?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that all of our stories, in particular the ones that are made public, if one is a public person as he was, and as many of us are, there is a great gap between the personal subjective reality and the publicly perceived reality of one's life. And I wanted to enter into that gap, really, and take the measure of the distance between the two, and use that, I suppose, in some ways as a exemplum. I mean, for all of our lives are bifurcated in that same sense, and trying to make them cohere is an honorable and maybe philosophically ambitious and psychologically turbulent thing to try to do for Leonard Fife, especially because the gap between the two is so vast, really, in many ways. The perceived man, the historical man, and the private, secret man, even to the point where his wife doesn't know him. I suppose in some sense that the book is too about the ultimate unknowability of another human being. Strange thing perhaps for a novelist to be trying to do, and to explore that mystery and come to that conclusion. But in fact, that's a theme in the book, and it's one that I think obsessed me in the writing of the book.
And that, I guess that whole
writing life, I don't know.
Well, I was going to say that isn't that the kind of the quest that all novelists go upon, to try and, a task that they can never succeed in the sense of defining the unknowable life. And the sense, kind of jumping in the, was it around you as a writer, exploring that sense of the stories that we create for ourselves, and how that works, and the fictions that we create and how we find truths within them? Was that a really important element?
Yes, I mean, you're working as a writer, as I think many of us are in our most intimate relationships too, from the assumption that you can make yourself, your inner self, known somehow. And for a writer, the process really of doing that depends upon the rigor, the discipline, the attention, devotion even to language, the tradition of the form you're working with, the limits and the possibilities of the form, the process, I guess, of writing fiction. You're working with the assumption that process will allow you somehow to transcend those limitations, and we can, through that means, know the interior of another human being. And in Fife's case, it's particularly complex, perhaps, because he's partially hallucinating his past, and he's an unreliable narrator in the room. And my task as a writer was to try to have a reliable narrator intercede between the reader and the character Fife, without breaking his and violating, in a way, the authenticity of his subjective life as he's recounting. I got very interested in the process of confabulation in the writing of this book. I mean, this psychological phenomenon known as confabulation, where memories and fantasies and lived experiences and invented experiences, sometimes perceived through films or books or other people's lives, and so forth, get mingled together and reconstructed all on the same plane of reality and believability to the person experiencing confabulation. It happened to a member of my family as he entered into dementia in his 80s, and a man I loved very much, and I sat next to him and tried to understand, really what was he experiencing? This multi-layered, kaleidoscopic kind of reality, and then realized that my character Fife was in a similarly vulnerable place where he too would be confabulating his own past, determined to tell the truth. But was it really the truth of what happened, or was it the truth of what he now believes happened?
Yes, and I think that that question is a kind of really tense kind of question within reading the book, and also quite heartbreaking as you go through. And Leo wants to tell his story, and he wants to have his, he wants to apply his narrative structure to his confession. Mm-hmm. But the more he tries to tell the story, the more lost he becomes. Yeah. And I guess there's one element of that being the kind of confabulation, but also the element of his physical deterioration. That writing about the kind of the loss of the physical was very powerful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, he's fading, of course, and it's the effect of the medications as well, the chemo that he's been enduring and the morphine that he's taking now against the pain. And so we're very aware, as the novel unfolds, of the ingredients that are poisoning his consciousness in a way, and the struggle that he's undergoing against that in order to tell the truth, as it were, what he believes is the truth, in the face of bewilderment and confusion and disappointment on the part of the witnesses, of the part of Malcolm, the filmmaker, and then more especially Emma, the wife of many years, who keeps trying to explain to Malcolm and the others that no, he's got this all mixed up. I mean, he's talking about things that actually happened to me or something like that. And yet they have to be presented in the novel as if Fife absolutely believes that the truth of the matter lies in what he's saying. That these things happened to him.
Yeah, and that moment where Emma kind of tries to cover or protect Leo and say, no, these are this happened to me and this happened to me. Yeah. It's very powerful because obviously they've been together for 40 years and she's trying to protect him. But then as a reader, you're like, the doubt and the kind of the insecurities you as a reader is then from that point starts to disintegrate. And I wanted to talk a little bit, one of the other tensions as he tells his story in this kind of very confined space, which I kind of, as these times of lockdown, of that many people stuck in a room talking about things, he says that he can't tell this story in private. He can't just tell it to Emma because he will then just he will try and make it sound nice. He'll try and make the truth sound better than it is to make him look better to her because he loves her. So he can only tell the truth in front of the camera. Why was that important for you?
Well, it's a little bit of what I was saying a little bit earlier about the process of making a work of art. Imposes the obligation to tell the truth in a way that an intimate relationship doesn't, even between a man and his lifelong wife or companion. Even in that situation, you'll still try to seduce the person. You'll still try to make the person love you somehow, which you can't do if you're an artist, if you're a novelist, if you're a filmmaker. You can't do that. Your commitment is elsewhere. And so he believes that he can't, if he's left alone in a room with his wife and he tries to tell her the truth of what happened in his life, he'll soften it. He'll make it glow a little bit if he can. He'll lighten it and bend it and so on. But if he's forced to talk to a camera in the process of making a film, he'll have to tell the truth, the bald and embarrassing and in some ways even humiliating truth of, as his case is of much of betrayal and abandonment.
Yeah, and that the story he does tell is kind of it's a destruction of his foundation myth, his creation myth, and he goes back to all, his family, his education, his past relationships and marriages, and it's fascinating for him as a character that there's a point where he says that to be stasis is the worst place for him to be. It's a paralysis if he stops still, and the whole journey that he goes on is both very powerful, but it also kind of, you move through many of the kind of slightly iconic areas of American culture, and he kind of plays with them and then runs away with them. Were you looking to kind of, particularly I was struck by, there was lots of narratives around that kind of American novel, the American South. Were you particularly looking to kind of deconstruct those a bit?
I think so, not so consciously as you're proposing, perhaps, but certainly they structure my personal imagination naturally. I mean, I was born in 1940, and so there are narratives of on the road and quest novels and the American myth of the independent and individualized human, especially white male, in control of his destiny, etc. I mean, these are very powerful parts of my own imagination, and those stories and narratives have structured, and so it's inevitable that they would end up in guiding this book in some ways, and also being subjected to a critique in this book, as they are in others that I've written as well. I mean, it's not an unusual theme for me, I guess, to go back and deconstruct, as you say, those American myths of lighting out for the territory, starting with Huckleberry Finn. It comes forward all the way to the present. It's this perennial myth, and Fife is a person who was driven by those myths as well, and also use those myths in order to justify acts of betrayal and abandonment and so forth throughout his life. And now he's calling himself to account for all that.
I was interested because at some point when you're particularly talking about Fife and in the kind of his Canadian life and in his old age, you describe him as a calculating man. Which kind of, I think, relates to that, he's calculated how he can tell his story by being on camera, and that's how he can do his confession. But in his journey, essentially, we follow some kind of narrative from adulthood, into his marriages and his journey. Essentially his journey north. He doesn't seem like a man who knows what he's doing. He just seems.
For all his calculations, he's an impulsive man, yes, and a sudden mover, a man who swerves in his tracks and goes in another sudden direction. He goes off to college as a scholarship boy, and he lasts a few weeks or barely a month, and suddenly he abandons that and heads hitchhiking off to Florida, to Miami, pretending that he's going to join Fidel Castro in the revolution in the winter of 1958-59. So swerves again, and after that, and heads to the Northeast and the big cities, Boston, and builds another beginning to a life. He goes from one beginning of a life to another, which is very American phenomenon. To keep on starting your life over again.
Is that, yeah, I guess, is that the again, the myth of the American dream, in the sense of, you can just pick up and move on and you'll be fine, and he doesn't suffer any consequences along that journey. He kind of leaves destruction in his wake, but doesn't really have to deal with it.
No, he doesn't have to pay for it until the end. I mean, the way we all eventually have to pay, I suppose. But he is a man who's trying to, in the end, find a way for redemption, because you're right. I mean, he hasn't paid along the way. He's left wreckage behind him. And he's lied to everyone who has surrounded him with admiration, praise, and so forth, and financial success. He's lied, and he's suddenly now on his deathbed, basically hoping to find a way to gain redemption, and it's not that easy. He has to be forgiven, mainly by his, but also by himself. There is a very crucial scene there towards the end where I think the book, like Fife, comes up against that wall and is forced to confront it and try desperately to get over that final wall between him and redemption. So yeah, I mean, the themes of the book are I suppose are universal and perennial, but I wasn't able, as I began by saying, to have entered those mysteries, really moral and ultimate mysteries, until I was older. This is not a book I could have or would have even conceived of writing when I was younger. Even in my 60s, I don't think so. I think I needed to, like, the horizon had to come a little bit closer and closer so I could see it. There's not much between me and the setting sun.
I'm sure there is a lot still to go, but I think that was a really powerful moment in Leo's story, where he talks about Emma still has the fear of dying, whereas he knows he's dying. That kind of, that, again, that absurdity and structure around life, in a sense, and that flip of going, well, actually, we have to, he has to face the reality that he will die. And for you, in kind of terms of writing the book and writing his old age and his kind of deterioration, how did you find that in terms of, personally?
Well, in some odd and unpredictable ways, the book liberated me. I finished this novel in December 2019, and started another right away that I had done research for. And by September 2020, this is during the pandemic and the lockdown, of course, I had finished the next novel and then immediately started another one. Suddenly it liberated me. after several years, a decade really, between books, during which time I did a great deal of writing. I did nonfiction writing. I wrote some screenplays and short stories and so forth. But a decade where my production as a writer had fallen off, as a fiction writer. And suddenly there was this surge that followed the completion of Foregone. It's as if I was able to cast off a set of inhibitions and restrictions and fears that I had had up to that point. And that Foregone was liberating for me.
Wow, that's fascinating. I keep forgetting to say to people at home, please do ask a question. I think there's one in the box, so we'll come to those shortly. But yeah, I think that's very fascinating in terms of Foregone kind. I'm also actually both relieved and delighted that more books are on the way. In this novel, I think there's obviously a very strong relationship between America and Canada, and also the kind of his narrative story and journey focuses a lot on 1968 and the Vietnam War and the draft dodgers. For you as a writer, does that feel, that period, is that a kind of pivotal moment in history, in your personal history, in your political history?
Certainly in my personal history, and we know how important it is politically in the United States, history of the United States. And the connection to Canada, I should perhaps digress a bit about it, is very powerful for me because for various reasons. One is I've lived most of my adult life and my childhood near the border in upstate New York or northern New England. And three of my grandparents and my father, Canadian born, and I'm now have dual citizenship, and I've been back and forth with to Canada most of my adult life, and feel a very close connection to it, to the country and to the people and to its history. So it was a chance for me to kind of explore that aspect of my own personal history and familial history as well. And put my arm around the shoulder of Canada and say, I'm one of yours too, and get into it, get close to it. But to go back to your question, that era, 1960, late 60s, was terribly important for me. It was a great political awakening that really began a little earlier. I can't say that I was apolitical, but I was rather typical, soft, romantic, idealistic youth, American youth of that era of the late 60s, late 50s, early 60s, in rebellion against conformity mainly, but not in any conscious political way. And I went to university at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in '64 and got caught up in the civil rights movement, which was a great awakening in many ways for me. And that led into the anti-war movement, which I was very involved with at Chapel Hill and afterwards, and was one of the founding members of the Students of Democratic Society, SDS, and the Chapel Hill chapter. So I was very much an activist, and it was defining and shaping my imagination and my political morality very intensely during that period, as it was for most everyone of my generation, really, one way or the other. I mean, it was formative, really formative. And I've carried that on into the present, and so the book was a chance to return to that era in some ways and rethink it, recalibrate its effect on me and on so many of my cohort of my generation, really.
Yeah, and you have some great scenes with Joan Baez and a young Bob Dylan. Was that there are, I guess, within the nature of the novel, it's not really playful moments, but was that a piece where you could kind of bring some classic musicians back to life in a sense?
Yeah, I hope so. It was one of the more enjoyable aspects of writing this book was rethinking about what the young Joan Baez and the young Bobby Zimmerman or Bob Dylan were really like. Well, I don't know what they were really like. I never had the opportunity, but it was fun to put them in. But the initial reason was that concert in Toronto that Baez went to when she was pregnant, and her husband, David Harris, had been imprisoned for refusing induction into the military. She went up and all the American expats who were up there fleeing the war expected her to come and in a sense, congratulate them and praise them, when she scolded them and said they all should have stayed in the United States and should have gone to prison like her husband David. And if so, that would have ground the war machine to a halt, because nobody would have allowed 60,000 young white men, as they were mostly white, to go to prison if they resisted the war. And she had a point, and that was a much argued point back then too on the left, which was more effective: flight to Sweden and Canada, or David Harris's resistance, except going to prison. And if the numbers had reached 60,000 young white middle class educated American men going to prison in order to oppose the war, I think it would have had an impact that nothing else would have. Nothing else did have, I should say.
Yeah, and I think that it's fascinating looking back on that now. And I think as I, working in Toronto, get to learn the country's history, that impetus of energy into Canada, I think, do you think it kind of created a real cultural shift in how particularly the literature and the music moved forward in Canada?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask someone who was there then and is still there now and tracked it more closely than I did over those years. But it certainly did have an impact, because most of them, as I said, were had good educations, and most of them were Anglophones, so they ended up in Toronto and BC by and large. But a lot of them ended up also in Quebec and New Brunswick and became francophones, and as our friend Leo Fife does. So it had to have an impact. Many of them entered professions and media professions and as you say, music and cinema and so forth. So it had to have a charge, brought with it a charge,
Yeah. We have a couple of questions which I will ask of you. A question from Janet says that I'm interested at the start. Russell said Foregone is a book he couldn't have written when any younger. How does he now view his earlier novels, and how does he feel about that earlier author self and what was created?
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't write the books that I wrote in my 40s now. So, I mean, the reverse is true also. Books I wrote in my 30s or 40s, I wouldn't think to do it if I were starting to write now in old age. They are, I guess, they are characteristic in many ways of the self that I was at that age. Something like Continental Drift, Affliction, the themes that torment those books were themes that tormented me at that time, and so they were different. I'm sure a critic could identify certain commonalities that across the board, but I don't think I can. You write a book, a novel, work of fiction, in order to try to understand something that you can't understand any other way. And it's a mystery. You want to penetrate a mystery, and it can only be done by writing a novel that allows you access to this mystery. The center of it takes you to the center of it. And what was mysterious to me in an important way when I was 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 is different than what was mysterious to me in my late 70s. And what is mysterious to me now in my early 80s too. I mean, that I think is true. So as long as that's what you're trusting the process to do, to let you enter into the mystery that obsesses you at that moment in your life, it's going to be a different one each time. If the novel is at all successful, I mean, to the writer, not necessarily in the larger world, then then you've actually penetrated that mystery. It no longer hovers over you. You've put it behind you.
And so what?
Even on a Monday, you do a lot of research for a work of fiction. Generally, I do anyhow, and for about a brief period, maybe 18 months or so, you're the world's expert on whatever that subject is. But as soon as you finish the novel, you forget it all. It's gone. You no longer have any need for it. There was a period when I was the world's expert on the island of Jamaica. I was the world's expert on the history of Liberia at one point. I was the world's expert on John Brown, the abolitionist. And then briefly here, I was an expert on the American expats who fled the Vietnam War to Canada.
I mean, you said there that the novel offers, is the one way of getting into a mystery, and kind of, so why is what is it about the novel that particularly enables these mysteries to be explored and, if successful, solved?
It's hard to say, though I can say this about it, because I've worked in other forms. I wrote a libretto for an opera. I've written screenplays. And with a novel, you are alone. You're all by yourself. There's no collaboration. There's no even sense of audience. It is the most solitary of the arts, I think, in some ways. And the thing that's, much decried is also the thing that gives you its unique access to to those things which are at your deepest level. One's deepest level are both important and mysterious and unknown to you. And I can only attribute that to the kind of solitude that it imposes. Sometimes 3, sometimes 4 or 5. I've taken 7 years at times to write a book, and that's that's a long time to be alone thinking.
That's true. We have another question from Jeffrey, who says, the techniques and processes of filmmaking feel very real in the novel. Did friends in the movie business give advice on the manuscript?
Yes, thanks, Jeffrey. That's true. I, over the years, became very good friends with the Canadian filmmaker Atta Magoyan, who made The Sweet Hereafter, such an elegant and lovely movie. And we remained friends. And it made me very anxious when I sent him the manuscript to ask him to vet it for me, make sure I didn't make any glaring and obvious mistakes, either about Canada or about filmmaking. And he picked up a few things that I needed to correct it. And another friend I have was a documentary filmmaker named Denis Mueller, who also agreed to read it for me and make sure I got he's a documentary filmmaker, so we wanted to make sure I had the documentary filmmaking aspects of it correctly. And I did have a funny experience that actually guided me. A couple of years before I started this book, a filmmaking team from documentary filmmakers from the Netherlands came over, and they wanted to make a film interview with me, and they did exactly what Fife does, what Malcolm does in setting it up. They put me in a room in the middle of a darkened room. A black box, really, with an overhead spot, and then they just moved the camera around, and so I was surrounded by darkness, but with a light over my head, and I thought, this is really an interesting way to do an interview, because it's close to a first-person narrator in a novel, You're all by yourself in a room with nothing around you to distract you or to distract the viewer. It's just surrounded by blackness, and so that led me to the idea of setting up this film in this novel in this cinematic way.
And that space is it's very claustrophobic, and again, the kind of you take us along bits of the story, and you think, oh, we're kind of here. We're gonna and we're gonna break for sandwiches. It's 3:15, and then a couple of pages later, now it's 10:30, and all that kind of moving around with time is very unnerving for the reader.
Well, and in that context, it opens it up, funnily, in an odd way. It's by not having any changes visible in the room. The light doesn't change, weather doesn't penetrate it. I mean, it's some description early on about how thick the walls are, and maybe raining and sleeting and snowing outside on Sherbrooke, but that's outside. It's in another world. This little self-enclosed black box is the only world, and so you're free to invent everything if you want in it.
As perhaps Leo does.
Yes.
Or doesn't. So there is another question from Laura, who says, do you have a process to approaching writing a novel, and does it differ to writing short stories and poetry?
Well, it's good that she adds also poetry, because writing short stories is much closer to writing poetry for me. It's lyric poetry, maybe not epic poetry, but and it seems to use a different part of one's brain than writing novels does. Something about a short story that dictates your being able to remember the beginning when you get to the end. If you can't remember the beginning when you get to the end, you don't know what the story was about, and it may not have been about anything. They have to be somehow held in your mind at the same time. Whereas with a novel, it's the opposite. It seems the novel has a mimetic effect to the flow of time, such that you really, by the page 75 or so, you have forgotten the beginning, just as you have forgotten your beginning and the flow of time in your consciousness. And so a novel imitates time in a way that the short story sort of stands outside of time and frames it and puts it in a box almost, and the way a poem does too, a lyric poem. So they're very different in that sense. And, but they overlap in some senses, I suppose, in the process of invention. I try not to over-control the narrative with novels, and also with short stories, and make it a process of discovery for me as much as possible, and not anticipate everything except in a kind of vague and undeveloped way that's ahead of me, and work in relatively small pitches.
And so in relation to that, in writing this novel, you obviously, in terms of the kind of the present day narrative, there was an end point, but in terms of going on Fife's journey through America, was there a path that you wanted to go on, or did you want just to see where he took you?
The overriding path is, there are three timelines in it, really. There's a dominant timeline, or the more immediate present timeline, as he's the one day that he's being filmed. And then there's the long day's journey that he makes as he narrates it from Virginia to Canada, first to Boston, and then to Vermont, and then to Canada in 1968. And then there are the journeys that he makes in the earlier years, from childhood and adolescence forward, to Florida, to Virginia, to Boston, to Virginia, and so forth. And that timeline coexists with the other two. But I hope it's not confusing. Most people who have read it seem to find that they lock together in a way that makes it fairly easy to follow, whether you're in the immediate present and in this darkened room with Fife in his late 70s, or you're with Fife in his late 20s when he's traveling north from Virginia, or you with Fife when he's 14, 15, or 16 years old, and so forth, in his youth. So, but it was an interesting challenge to try to bring all those three timelines into easy proximity, so that without confusing the narrative in any way.
Mm. The particularly Fife's journey from Virginia up to Vermont is particularly evocative, when they get on the plane and smoking on the plane and all that. It's kind of like the whole time period.
Rub a cigarette out on the floor of the plane
just before landing. We have one last question from Charlene, who says, I find your novels luminous in their own ways, but your protagonists are often in heartbreaking positions, eliciting strong emotions in the reader. Does the grief and sadness and loneliness you write about invite themselves into your daily life as you are writing about them? And if so, how do you keep them at bay?
Oh, it's not always, I don't always keep them at bay. They enter into my life, these characters, and take it over for a period. My wife, when I was writing Cloud Splitter, which is a very long novel, it took a very long time to write, about the abolitionist John Brown. Some think of as a fanatic, others think of as a heroic figure, unique in American history in many ways. She said, I feel like I'm married to John Brown, and because this has taken over your life to such a degree. And I think that's true for most fiction writers. The characters do take over your life. Their consciousness becomes your consciousness. Otherwise, you couldn't write the novel. And yes, and these are mostly, I write mostly about troubled men, mostly, but not always, and incidents that are for them cataclysmic, or for the people around them who love them cataclysmic. And so one does have to endure them, but there's no other way to get that close to the characters, really, unless you're willing to let them enter your life and take it over for a period.
Mm-hmm.
Just for a period.
And I think that, you talked about, I think there is the fact that you turned face on into kind of looking at Fife's story and his approaching death, in a sense, and the fact that the catharsis of perhaps both of writing it has, you talked about that liberation. So I think that kind of looking face on is what, again, that mystery of what the novel is.
I wonder. I think that's possibly true, and maybe that that may have been a good answer to the question. That it's if you face these demons that these stories evoke, then you're free of them afterwards. You're liberated by them afterwards. Yeah.
But then, as we as readers carry them as a kind of insight and inspiration, and I'm afraid we have run out of time. I'm afraid, but thank you so much to Russell Banks for a wonderful, insightful conversation. I'm very excited about the fact that you have written 2 new books. Look forward to hearing more about those. For everyone else at home, thank you so much for coming. If you haven't bought the book, please do. It's on special offer for tonight with a signed book plate from Russell. If I have to give a plug to the Toronto International Festival of Authors, which will be digital this year, so you can watch it from the comfort of your UK home. And so please do come visit us in Toronto. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much, Russell. Take care and see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Roland.
Pleasure.